welcome to the Conference of Poverty, Pathways, Challenges and Transitions hosted by the Alliance of Working Class Academics, who Geraldine will introduce. We've got most of the committee members here today, but it's really nice to introduce you. My name is Dr. Craig Johnson. I've spoken to most people on Twitter, I would imagine. I'm the Deputy Chair of OCA, and I'm a proud working class academic. My mother was a cleaner, my father was a factory worker for 45 years, and it is great to be able to have the tools as an academic to raise awareness of poverty and class. And I'm proud to say, I think I was the only one in my tenement, and several tenements beside me to go to university. That is changing now, which is great to see as well, and there's a lot more sort of PhD students coming out with class in their title as well, which is excellent. We've got a great list of speakers, presenters. Today we tried to make it as practitioners, seasoned academics, as well as people from different countries and continents as well, so please bear with that. If you can have your mics off at all times, cameras, as I said, is optional. Teams seems to prefer it's when it's not, when your cameras are actually off, but it's nice to have those cameras on. Of course, if you're presenting, if you're on the panel, that's fine too. So if we could use chat to raise some questions, which I will try to keep a note of and we'll talk about at the end, but also just to encourage and have a discussion as well. And as I said, this is being recorded and we will be hoping to have this available. If you do have internet problems, if you are presenting, that's understandable. We'll give it a couple of minutes, just switch back on as well. Okay, but without further ado, I'll hand over to the chair, Professor Geraldine van Buren.
Thank you very much, Craig, and welcome everybody to our first international conference, the first international conference of the Alliance of Working Class Academics. And I'd like to begin actually by thanking Craig, who's been working incredibly hard, and he's been very ably assisted by Charlie, if he can raise his hand, and also Carol, the same. I'd also like to thank Paul and Sarwan, who've also been contributing and will be contributing to the day, as well as Michelle. And Michelle also has designed our website, so we're very grateful to her for that. We're very young, but we've been incredibly busy and I think achieved quite a lot in our short life. We've conducted formal mentoring sessions led by Carol, Charlie and Craig, and we also do a lot of informal mentoring. We have extended our remit, so we have Michelle in the United States and we extend to Steve in Australia, and we're going to extend even further. We have adopted, and we'd love you to look at that and let us know your comments, a university code on equal opportunity for working class students and academics. And in just over a year, actually, we've already been contacted by university regulators in Scotland and England, and they put it up on their websites, the universities. We've spoken with the Scottish Minister for Universities. Some of us have addressed conferences in the United States and the Netherlands, and we've linked with the Working Class Library, the Working Class Classics Scholars, and Classy, a working class academics in the University of Utrecht. And we're all voluntary, and if you'd like to contribute to our work, we'd be delighted to meet with you. And take it further. Our ultimate goal is to prevent and prohibit class discrimination in all its forms, and how it impacts on us in universities is going to be explored today. I'm very honoured to introduce our first speaker, Diane Reay, who I asked if she'd send me a biography, and what arrived was something very modest. Very powerful gravity here, it's just dropped on the floor. So Diane is very well known and much admired and much read. She grew up as a free school meals pupil on a large council estate in England, and she, like many of us as well, first in the family to go to university. She actually became an inner city primary school teacher for 2 decades, trying to make education a much more positive experience for working class children. And she says, in her words, it was a failure to do this that led her on to academia. the failure, I think, was probably not her, but all the structural factors. We're quite an unusual committee, I should tell you. Very few committees I've sat on have quite a significant number of committee members who were truanting at school. Yet this is the case for ORCA, the acronym we have adopted. And she's been involved in educational research at the highest level for over 30 years. She's worked on projects on mothers' involvement in the child's education, children's experience of educational transition, working class students in higher education. She's also researched black supplementary schooling, attitudes and experiences of the white middle classes sending their children to ethnically diverse inner city schooling, and children's experiences of both testing and setting by ability. She's now been honoured and is Emeritus Professor of Education at the University of Cambridge. And if you haven't read her latest book, I would recommend it to you, which is Miseducation, Inequality, Education and the Working Classes, which was published by Policy Press in 2017. As I say, we're honoured that you're speaking to us, and I very much look forward to what you're going to say to us today. Diane, it's up to you.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction. And it's lovely to be here. So thank you so much for inviting me. I'm now going to, I hope Craig's at the ready, press the share tray and hope that my PowerPoint is something that's going to be shared with everybody.
This is going to work brilliantly, Diane, guaranteed.
Haha.
Oh, wait a minute.
Okay, can you see it?
Yeah, see, that's brilliant. We're good to go.
Okay. Well, I'm talking about poverty, the working classes and education. And poverty is very clearly a class, and more specifically, a working class issues. There's disputes about the extent of poverty, but the latest figures from government put the percentage at 30%. And the Joseph Rowntree Trust say that it's 33%. So a third of school children are living in poverty, but there's an enormous overlap between poverty and being working class. So that means that even a cautious estimate would put nearly half of all working class children among the poor in our society. Likewise, for Black, Asian, minority ethnic children, 50% of Black British and 58% of Bangladeshi and Pakistani children are growing up in poverty. Poverty among children is much higher among Bangladeshi, Pakistani, Black and Chinese ethnic groups than it is among the Indian and white ethnic groups. I think we can say that in 2022, to our shame, at least 40% of children are growing up in poverty. But with the wave of austerity currently being unleashed by our Tory government, by 2024, we could well have over 50% of all working class children living in poverty. Child poverty and unequal educational opportunities are inextricably linked. Children's educational prospects reflect the disadvantages of their families, those who are poor, whose parents have low or no qualifications, no or low status jobs, who live in inadequate housing, disadvantaged neighbourhoods, and less likely to gain good qualifications themselves when they go to school. And in the UK, we're particularly bad at enabling children living in poverty to succeed educationally. So this is in part because the poor in the UK are more economically impoverished than the poor in other European countries. So a report published earlier this year shows that low-income families in the UK are now 22% poorer than their counterparts in France and 21% poorer than low-income households in Germany. And if we look at this next slide, hopefully, we can see here that the percentage of children from working class backgrounds who are doing well is really bad. We're bottom of the league table for working class achievement. So less than 3% of working class children in England are educational high achievers. And this toxic relationship between poverty and educational failure persists despite the fantasy about meritocracy. And we, of all the European countries, have the greatest belief in meritocracy, despite having the lowest levels of social mobility. And this combination of a strong belief in meritocracy combined with low levels of social mobility allow the British middle and upper classes to conduct the moral equivalent of a magician's sleight of hand. We can conjure up the myth that everybody who has the ability and works hard enough will inevitably succeed, disregarding issues of low levels of resources. So here we see we have the lowest level of social mobility, lower even than the US. Yet over 50% of Britons believe meritocracy is working. And I want to argue that meritocracy is one of the main reasons for the high tolerance of poverty in Britain. And it's also why we rely on the education system to sort out the problem of poverty, rather than focusing on achieving greater economic justice or a stronger welfare state. But just to give you a few more facts, the income disparity between the richest and poorest sections of the population more than doubled between the 1960s and the 2020s. Income inequality is off the scale in Britain, and that's literally, as you can see in my next slide. And it's far worse than in other developed nations, and this is partly because of British attitudes to the wealthy and the acquisition of wealth. In 2019, only 29% of British participants were in favour of drastically reducing the salaries of the highest paid executives and giving more money to workers. And this was the lowest percentage of all 20 countries surveyed, and a huge difference from the French and German, where over 50% were in support. We are a society that still remains intensely relaxed about people getting filthy rich, even as the wealth gap gets wider and wider. And we also have one of the most unfair taxation systems in the Northern Hemisphere. Currently, the 10% poorest households pay on average 47% of their income in tax, while the richest 10% pay on average 34%. Now, if we look at the extent to which different stages of childhood and later life, one's social background interacts with educational prospects, we can see that by age 3, being in poverty makes a difference equivalent to 9 months development in school readiness. And at each stage of compulsory schooling, the poverty gap grows. And in particular, there's an enormous jump early in secondary school, with children living in poverty nearly 2 years behind at the age of 14. Children who do badly at primary school are less likely to improve at secondary school if they're poor. And also children who are only slightly below average at primary school are much more likely to be among the worst performers at secondary school if they're poor. Young people with parents in manual occupations remain far less likely than others to go to university. And even though their prospects have improved, they've not been the main beneficiaries of university expansion. Children of non-manual workers are over 2.5 times as likely to go to university than children of manual workers. And the white working classes make up just 5% of the intake to Russell Group universities. And at my own university, Cambridge, they are less than 2%. And finally, children from poor families are more likely to have poor qualifications. There are more teenagers outside education, employment and training in the UK than in most other countries. And that rate is rising. So that's some facts and statistics. But I now want to look at the more thorny moral issues of where responsibility is seen to lie for inequalities in educational access and attainment. And increasingly in the UK, it's seen to lie with the poor themselves. And this is what I call in my work the curse of meritocracy, because it justifies making social mobility and educational achievement the responsibility of the working class individual when they lack the resources to make either possible. Rather than focusing on getting the working class individual to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, we need to focus on the relational nature of poverty, to move beyond the prevailing view that poverty is the responsibility of the poor and recognise that it's largely the responsibility of the privileged, and in particular, our political elites. And the educational failure of the poor is in part due to our historically polarised educational system. Private schooling has long been one of the principal means by which elitism and social divisions are produced and perpetuated in the UK. Historically, a majority of private schools were originally set up to educate the clever sons of the poor. So when Eton and Winchester were established 600 years ago, it was written into their charters that they should be taking pupils from the community and from poor communities. But the schools were hijacked by the wealthy and used to educate their own children. And in doing so, their charitable purpose was corrupted to accentuate the advantage of the already privileged. And today, just 6,000, that's 1 in 100, privately educated pupils are on 100% bursaries. 99% of the children attending private schools are rich. And yet, rather than being held up and subject to critique and reform, the private school system has always been held up as the ideal to which the state sector should aspire. And Brian Jackson and Dennis Marsden wrote Education and the Working Classes over 50 years ago. And they argued that our educational system is one based on selecting and rejecting in order to rear an elite. It still is. The faltering commitment to comprehensive schooling and its underlying rationale of inclusion and social mixing is fundamentally undermined by structures such as private schooling that perpetuate privilege and segregated schooling. But private schools also take up a very inequitable share of educational spending. Around 25% of school spending goes on the 7% of students who are privately educated. But now we have increasing polarisation within the state sector. There's always been working and middle class schools, but with the increased focus on parental choice, that polarisation has grown. And it's been combined with increasingly devastating effects of chronic underfunding over the last 15 years, as working class schools in particular suffer from dilapidated buildings and narrow curriculum and an over-reliance on standardised tests and basic skills. But over the last decade, there's been a further worrying development. Poverty in disadvantaged communities has moved into the schools serving those poorer areas. They're the most under-resourced, they're most likely to have buckets collecting water from unrepaired roofs, the most likely to have food banks operating in their school halls, to have the narrowest curriculum and the least SEND resources. Instead of compensating for the poverty of children attending their schools, the norm is now for the schools themselves to be impoverished in terms of infrastructure, resources and curriculum. I think we can say now that we have rich and poor schools that are segregated along the lines of class, and this is within the state sector. These schools are increasingly reflecting the poverty of their locality rather than being able to redress it, compounding social and educational inequalities. But any improvement in education will not reduce income inequality and redress poverty unless there's fairer and just economic policies. And firstly, research shows there's no such thing as equal rewards for the same work. Those from working class backgrounds who go to university and gain degrees overwhelmingly receive lower pay than the more privileged do for the same work, and end up in lower status jobs even when they have the same qualifications. Research this month found that on average, a working class graduate is paid £6,000 to £7,000 a year less than their middle class counterpart, and it's even worse if you're a working class woman. Secondly, educational inequality is inevitable in a neoliberal capitalist economy like Britain. Schools embody the contradictions between the logic of capitalism, which requires inequality to thrive, and the logic of democracy, which rests on principles of political and social equality. It will always be those with less resources, and the working classes have the least resources, who lose out in the hyper-competitive race that English education has become. As Warren Buffett, the American billionaire, said, we increasingly have socialism for the rich and capitalism for the poor. The advantaged in society will always actively work to ensure their own children's opportunities are qualitatively superior to other children's. A further problem is that overall we have little understanding of how children from families living in poverty experience school. We know little about how growing up in poverty affects children's relationships with school friends and with teachers, although we do know that the more disadvantaged children are, the lower their levels of subjective well-being in relation to their schooling. And we can see from this table that 57.5% of those children growing up in poverty are unhappy at school. Children in low-income families are more likely to be socially excluded within school, to express concerns about having the right clothes, and even when they have school uniforms, to be really concerned about having the right trainers and shoes. Many children and young people whose families live in poverty are unable to participate fully in school lives because their parents simply cannot afford it. But recent education policies have further contributed to their negative experiences. The neoliberal armoury of educational initiatives has done so much damage to education for children in poverty through a toxic combination of test-based accountability, teacher evaluation linked to test scores, and the expansion of choice. And I now want to look at my own research, which examines educational experiences of children from poor backgrounds. And I'm going to draw on research over a 30-year period. And first of all, this is a 9-year-old white working class girl on free school meals talking about SATS results. And in this quote, Sharon provides a poignant summary of class destinies and how they're tied to academic achievement. Children living in poverty internalise a sense that their educational achievement, including exam results, define who they are and what they're capable of. And the risks of finding they have very little value are disproportionately high for such children. In the context of schooling, they inhabit a psychic economy defined by fear, anxiety, and unease, where failure looms large and success is elusive. For children living in poverty, test results were nearly always conflated with far-reaching consequences, in which good SATS results were linked to positive life prospects and poor results meant future failures and hardships. For many of these children, test results were not simply about how well they were able to perform, but went to the very heart of who they were and what they could become. But as well as segregation within schools, we also have segregation between schools. So we see here George talking about having to go to Chiltern and saying he hopes he doesn't have to go because the children there are all bad and no one's good at learning. And then there's Tafik, who says Deer Park's still going to be rubbish when it's changed because they're still the same students and the students are crap. But George ends up at Chiltern and Tafik goes to Deer Park, and both have to manage the balance between going to school seems to be rubbish with crap learners and trying to be successful learners. Such process of segregation are changing and limiting the ways in which different social classes relate to each other, increasing social distance, mistrust, and ignorance of those who are different to oneself. But in relation to the working classes, it's also sanctioning prejudice and contempt towards them from more privileged social groups. And we can see the harmful consequences in what a white middle-class girl told me. She said, I think Chiltern is good for the not so intelligent people, but for intelligent people, it's not good enough. As English schools have become more and more preoccupied with assessment, management and testing in order to separate meritocracy's winners from the losers, A culture of hyper-competition has intensified both within schools and between them. And we can see that in what's happening in nurseries, where children as young as 2 and 3 are being tested and ranked on the basis of their perceived ability. And the consequences are particularly vivid in the accounts I have of primary age children talking about the ability sets to which they've been allocated and what that means both for their standing in the peer group culture and their sense of themselves as learners. But guess what? It's mostly children from poorer, the low income families who are on free school meals who are in the bottom sets. And as well as creating a hierarchy of worth among children, this dividing them into winners and losers on the basis of perceived ability has led to children in the lower sets internally a sense that they have little or no value educationally. So here's Satvinder saying, you know, I could have gone to a better, higher place, but now there's no hope. And then we have Attic, who says, you know, I'm in a proper bad set now, so I've just become rubbish. And this was just 2 examples, but I have hundreds of quotes from working class children talking about the damaging impact of being judged and labelled. And the demoralisation of bottom set children that comes from being looked down and devalued was evident, particularly in the response of these 4 working class boys. Schooling has become a field of everyday micro acts of symbolic violence against children living in poverty. And although there's concern, there was not sufficient concern to implement changes that will make anything more than marginal differences to the vast majority of working class children's lives. Instead, over the last 2 decades, society's prevailing view is that the poor are to blame for their own poverty, and that has resulted in more surveillance, control, and discipline of working class children in schools. It has also, in growing numbers of academy schools, led to material as well as symbolic violence, as children living in poverty are off-rolled or placed in isolation booths. 68% of the largest academy trusts have some form of isolation room. And there's an academy in the northeast, which is in a predominantly disadvantaged working class area, where 48% of children have had some form of exclusion over a period of 2 years. And earlier this year, a head of the academy in the Northwest told me the main barrier to improving education attainment of working class students in her school was the aspiration apathy in their families. It was ever thus, one of the main themes emerging from research on poverty in schooling is a tendency to blame the parents. School staff in poor areas often talk in terms of poor parenting skill, or worse, parents who are not interested in their children's development or education. Often parents couldn't win. If they weren't in paid employment, teachers saw them as giving a bad example to their children. But if they worked long hours, they were seen as neglecting them. However, all the evidence demonstrates that while parental involvement in education helps a child's development, no amount of parental concern can count the worst impact of poverty on children. Also, the research evidence demonstrates that working class parents are extremely concerned about their children's cognitive development and about their educational attainment, just as concerned as middle and upper class parents. The difference is that they lack the resources, cultural, social, economic and emotional, to do much about it, unlike their middle class counterparts. So what are the possible solutions? Well, we will always be just tinkering around the edges of the problem until we have radical income redistribution that pulls people out of poverty. However, things do need to change drastically in an educational system that is clearly failing. We need a broad and balanced curriculum accessible to all that integrates the vocational with the academic, a curriculum that includes learning about democracy, equality, environmental and social and political awareness for all children. We should abolish private schools, or at the very least take away their ability to charge school fees. Cooperation, trust, compassion, collegiality and caring should be at the heart of our educational system, instead of the hyper-competition we have now. That would involve getting rid of SATs, league table setting and Ofsted. But the most important insight is that progressive changes in our educational system have to go hand in hand with progressive changes in the economy. We need regional regeneration, particularly of disadvantaged areas. As I've said many times before in many talks, teachers are being made responsible for problems of poverty in wider society that they do not have the resources to put right. They are left to firefight on the educational front line. Neither can we expect poor families to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. Instead, we need to recognise education cannot compensate for society in a deeply unequal country like Britain, and work collectively to make Britain a much fairer society. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Diane. That's absolutely excellent. Certainly lots and lots of comments, lots of applause there at the bottom as well. I will request control to see if that...
Yeah, take control away from me, please.
Yeah. I'm back. I don't know if anybody wants to see that. You finished brilliantly on time. It's almost like you've done that before, Diane. I didn't know if we want to have a couple of questions.
Yeah, that's fine.
Is that okay? We've got 5 minutes. Anybody would like to ask any questions?
I would.
Feel free, Jeremy.
Yes, I very much appreciated your talk, which I think resonated and gave evidence for the experiences of bullying, ridicule and so forth that many of us have felt at school. I was interested in your remedies, though, that you didn't mention prohibiting class discrimination as part of that, and I wondered what were your feelings on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of work that could be done legally in relation to, you know, making class discrimination something that should be treated as illegal and prohibited. But I think that I didn't talk very much about the solutions and what we should do. I focused very much on the contemporary situation and just how bad it's got. Because I mean, I do honestly think that a lot of education, particularly in secondary schools, has become a form of cruelty that's being inflicted on working class and particularly children from poorer backgrounds. And I do think we need remedies, but and we're not going to get any from our political elites. I mean, I know I held them responsible, but they're not accepting that responsibility, are they? So, I mean, I think it's really important for those of us who are activists and engaged in this area and want to see change to come together and start to put pressure on. I mean, I'm trying to do quite a lot of work with unions at the moment, including the NEU. And I think that if you want to see change, it has to come from below in the grassroots, rather than expecting our political elites to change their behaviour, because they're not going to do that anytime soon, are they?
Excellent.
Sorry, I hope that's not too depressing.
No, we've got two people. I think we've got time for 2 questions. So Kirsten, did you have a question?
It's Kirsten. Yeah, it was really just based on kind of a couple of things you said there, Dan. Thank you. That was really, really interesting. And I have to say, as I said in the comments, this is kind of a whole new world for me and an aspect of my academic life that I hadn't really considered or looked at, or I had, but not really appreciated that there's a wealth of information out there and a wealth of research. I suppose it's from my own experience, and I just wanted to know what your thoughts were, Diane, because you mentioned private schools, but certainly in my own geographical area, if you like, the kind of, certainly the divide, if you like, that's definitely apparent in opportunities for young people isn't so much the private school and non-private school, but where your school is in the catchment area and things. And I know you kind of touched on that as well. And I suppose what I'm asking is, what do you see as a response to that, as something that can help even that out? Because ultimately there's schools that are not private, but because of where they are, people who are working class definitely can't afford a school and a house within that catchment area, and the numerous obstacles that people have to climb over to prove that they live there, or etc. So I suppose, that's my question. What do you see as the way forward for that?
Well, it's very interesting. I mean, because I think a lot of our more damaging policies are a result of neoliberal policy initiatives, and they've come from the OECD. But the OECD have recently got really worried about inequality in education. And they're saying that we've got, because basically from the outside, we've got a failing education system. And they're saying that there's three things that are deeply problematic. One, we've got gross underfunding of our education system, and now we really have got rich and poor schools. And they are basically the working class schools and the middle class schools. And the latest Tory funding round is actually putting more schools, more money into those more privileged schools and less money into the actual working class schools. So it's going to make things worse. But the other thing that they're saying is that setting and streaming is really damaging relationships within society, different groups in society, but also parental choice. And I mean, I've just come back from 5 weeks in Japan. My grandchildren go to Japanese schools. Everybody goes to the local school because the local school is always a good enough school. Mm-hmm. No one would dream of making a choice because they expect their state to provide good schools for all children. You know, we've not had that for ages. There's a scramble and a hyper competition to get your child into the school at the top of the league tables. And there's a real difference in the quality and the standards of schools because of the unfair resourcing and unfair staffing.
And I think we're seeing in Scotland the inequalities from the way that they calculated exam results a few years back, because it was based, part of that decision 3 years ago was about how your school performed. And I know from my own experience, my older child got downgraded because it was based on the performance of his school. Whereas if you went to a school that had an overall better performance, you were likely to maintain or upgrade your grades. That was the predicted grade year. So there's a big impact there.
Can I just draw this to a close, if that's okay?
Sorry, thank you very much.
Thank you. I know John and Neil got questions, but Diane, do you mind answering a couple of those in the chat? Is that possible?
Yeah, that's fine.
Is that okay? I'm just keen to keep moving on because we have quite a tight schedule for everybody. But Geraldine, would you like to say anything in relation to thanking Diane? I don't know if you had anything prepared for that. Oh, I can't hear you.
I didn't have anything prepared because obviously I didn't know what she was going to say, but I would like to thank you very much. I mean, I think the evidence that you have provided up to date has been really helpful for everyone. I should say, I mean, Orca also works obviously with the ground roots, and we're meeting with the UCU shortly as well. And we'd welcome links with any other group. So we're trying to operate at different levels, which I think is probably what you would agree is a good way forward. And we hope, that you'll work with us in the future, because we're very admiring of your work and of you and your achievements. And I'd like to thank you again for coming to speak to us today.
Well, can I, in return, thank you very much. And I'd be very honoured to work in collaboration with the group. That would be great. So we must maintain our contacts.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Okay, so I'm going to pass over to the discussion panel.